Picture concrete carved into the side of a hill, sloping downward into darkness, wide enough for a stretcher, long enough to swallow the sound of footsteps before they ever reach daylight. 525 feet of tunnel cut into Waverly Hill on the edge of Louisville, Kentucky, running from a hospital ward down to a waiting hearse at the bottom. For decades, the people who built it told a simple story. It was there to spare patients the sight of the dead, to protect them from knowing how many of their neighbors never walked out the front door. That story was not entirely false, but it was not the whole truth either. The administration of Waverly Hills Sanatorium did not build that tunnel to protect the dying. They built it to protect something else, the institution's own reputation as a place where people got better. Tuberculosis killed slowly and visibly, and the doctors believed morale mattered almost as much as medicine. A hospital that looked like it was losing was a hospital nobody wanted to enter. So the bodies went underground, out of sight, while upstairs, the city of recovery kept smiling for the cameras. And here is the strange part. Almost nobody comes to Waverly Hills today to learn any of that. They come for a nurse who may never have existed, for shadows said to creep through that very tunnel, for a ghost named after a boy whose own death barely made it into the record books. The real horror of this place has been buried twice. Once by the people who ran it, and once by the people who turned it into a haunted house. Chapter 1. The Land, the Plague, and a Peaceful Name. To understand how Waverly Hills became a place built around hiding its dead, you have to go back to a quieter version of that hill, long before it had a tunnel, long before it had a single patient. In 1883, a man named Major Thomas H. Hayes bought a stretch of high ground south of Louisville and built his family a home there. The land sat a good distance from any schoolhouse, so Hayes did what a man of his standing could afford to do. He built one of his own, a one-room school for his children, run by a young teacher named Lizzie Lee Harris. Harris was fond of Sir Walter Scott's Waverly novels, and with Hayes' blessing, she named her little schoolhouse after them. Hayes liked the sound of it well enough that he renamed his entire property too. What had been just a hill became Waverly Hill. Over the following decades, through postcards, ledgers, and careless habit, that second E quietly disappeared, and the spelling settled into the name still used today, Waverly. By every account, it was a peaceful name for a peaceful place. Neither Hayes nor Harris could have known what the hill would eventually become. At the same time, the schoolhouse was teaching its handful of students, Louisville was fighting a war it could not see. Tuberculosis, what people of the era called the White Plague, was tearing through the city at a rate that outpaced almost anywhere else in the country. The disease thrived on exactly the conditions Louisville offered in abundance, a low-lying position in the Ohio Valley that trapped stagnant, damp air over the city, the smoke and grime of a rapidly industrializing town, and crowded tenement housing, where a single cough could move through an entire household within weeks. By the turn of the century, tuberculosis accounted for something close to 1 out of every 5 deaths in the city. It did not discriminate by class, but it thrived hardest among the poor, the crowded, and the exhausted. For years, Louisville's response amounted to little more than dispensaries, pamphlets, and anti-spitting ordinances, well-meaning gestures against a disease that did not care about good intentions. But it became clear that something far more ambitious was needed. A dedicated hospital built specifically to isolate the infected and, if the medicine of the era was to be believed, to heal them through nothing more complicated than fresh air, sunlight, and distance from the city's poisoned atmosphere. So, local health officials formed the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital and set out to find the right piece of ground. They needed elevation to catch clean air moving above the valley's stagnant layers. They needed seclusion to keep a highly contagious population away from the rest of the city. And they needed, perhaps without quite admitting it, somewhere far enough away that Louisville would not have to look at its own epidemic every single day. They found all three on a quiet hilltop south of the city, on land that already carried a name borrowed from a novelist's fiction. The board liked Waverly. It sounded nothing at all like a place where people went to die. Chapter 2. A City of Recovery is Born. Ground broke on Waverly Hill in 1908. What rose there was nothing like the looming brick fortress people picture today. Just a modest two-story wooden building, flanked by two open-air pavilions, one for men and one for women. The whole project cost $25,000, a fraction of what would later be poured into the hill, and it was built on a theory rather than a proven cure. Tuberculosis had no treatment in the way we understand the word now. There was no drug to give, no surgery that reliably worked. What doctors had instead was a belief, widely held and fiercely defended, that elevation and constant exposure to clean air could slow the disease, and that rest, sunlight, and nutrition could sometimes let a weakened body win the fight on its own. The sanatorium opened its doors on the 26th of July, 1910, with room for somewhere between 40 and 50 patients. For a city losing residents to tuberculosis at an alarming rate, that number was almost laughable. It was a single lifeboat lowered into an ocean of the sick. The flood came almost immediately. Within 2 years, the wooden sanatorium that had seemed ambitious in 1910 was hopelessly undersized. By 1912, with patients arriving faster than beds could be built, the hospital began pitching tents directly on the lawn, canvas shelters standing in for walls, because there was nowhere else to put the people walking through the gate. It was meant to be temporary. It became, for a time, simply how the hospital functioned. 2 years after that, in 1914, a children's pavilion was added, bringing another set of beds and a new, quieter kind of tragedy. A ward built not only for children sick with tuberculosis, but for the children of tuberculosis, patients who had nowhere else to go while their parents fought, and often lost, their own battle with the disease. What held this fragile, overcrowded place together was not medicine in any modern sense. It was a philosophy, repeated with total confidence by doctors who genuinely believed it, that the cure for the white plague lay in fresh air moving across a hilltop, in long hours spent resting on open porches regardless of season, in plain food and quiet days. Patients were photographed wrapped in blankets on snow-covered verandas, their breath visible in the cold, presented to the public as evidence that the treatment was working. In a sense, it was. Fresh air and rest were genuinely better for a tuberculosis patient than the crowded, airless tenements many of them had come from. But the language used to describe Waverly Hills in those early years was the language of science, precise, confident, backed by institutional authority. The reality underneath it was closer to hope dressed up in a doctor's coat. Nobody at Waverly Hills in 1910 could explain, in any way a modern physician would recognize, why fresh air should cure a bacterial infection. They simply believed it did, because believing it was the only weapon they had. It was an honest kind of desperation, and for a brief window, it looked enough like progress that Louisville could tell itself the hill was working. That belief would not survive what came next. Chapter 3. The Gothic Giant. That belief would not survive what came next, but it would be rebuilt, in brick, in concrete, and on a scale the original wooden hospital could never have imagined. By the early 1920s, the math at Waverly Hills had become impossible. Tuberculosis cases across Jefferson County kept climbing, the old wooden buildings kept rotting and catching fire risk with every passing winter, and the tents on the lawn were never meant to be a permanent solution to anything. The Board of Tuberculosis Hospital made a decision that would define the hill for the rest of the century: tear down the modest beginning and replace it with something built to look permanent, modern, and unstoppable. Construction began in March of 1924. The architect was a man named D.X. Murphy, already well known in Louisville for designing buildings meant to project authority and endurance. And what he produced on Waverly Hill was unlike anything the city's tuberculosis patients had seen before. 5 stories of brick and stone, rising in the Tudor Gothic revival style, with pointed arches, ornamental brickwork, and a silhouette that looked less like a hospital and more like a cathedral built for the dying. It opened on the 17th of October, 1926, after roughly 2.5 years of construction and just over $1 million spent. An enormous sum for the era, and a clear signal of how seriously Louisville now took the crisis on its doorstep. Inside, the building was engineered entirely around the era's treatment philosophy. Every floor had wide, open-air porches and solariums, designed so patients could spend hours exposed to sunlight and moving air regardless of the season. the fifth floor was given over almost entirely to heliotherapy, where patients with tuberculosis of the bone were wheeled out to lie beneath direct sunlight for hours at a time. The new building could hold 400 patients, 10 times what the original wooden sanatorium had offered, and for the first time, Waverly Hills looked less like an emergency measure and more like a permanent institution, and it was built to be permanent in every practical sense. Waverly Hills became almost entirely self-sufficient, a small city unto itself perched on a hillside south of Louisville. It had its own water treatment plant, drawing and purifying its own supply rather than relying on the city below. It had its own power plant, keeping the lights on independent of any outside grid. It had a farm and a working dairy that fed staff and patients alike, a bakery that turned out bread for hundreds of meals a day, a laundry, a maintenance garage, even its own post office and its own zip code. Doctors, nurses, and their families lived on the grounds, sometimes for years, rarely leaving. Waverly Hills did not need the outside world, and in a sense, it was built specifically so the outside world would not need to think about it either. This was the image the board wanted Louisville to see, a city of recovery, gleaming and self-contained, proof that the White Plague could be met with architecture, organization, and confidence. Photographs from the period show patients on long rows of porches, well-dressed nurses moving between beds. The building's Gothic towers rising against the sky like something built to last forever. It was, by every visible measure, a triumph. But the triumph had a crack in it from the very first day the doors opened, and it was not a crack anyone in Louisville's newspapers chose to photograph. Waverly Hills, in its grand new form, was a whites-only institution. Black patients suffering from the same disease, dying in the same county, were not admitted into the new 5-story building at all. They were left behind in the old wooden dispensary structure, the very buildings the new construction had been meant to replace, now repurposed as a separate and inferior tier of care for anyone who was not white. While white patients lay on heliotherapy porches in a building with its own power plant, black patients were treated in the structures that Louisville's own health officials had already decided were too outdated, too cramped, and too dangerous to keep using. That arrangement would not meaningfully change until the 1940s, decades after the Gothic building first opened its doors. The story Louisville told about Waverly Hills in 1926 was one of unity against a shared enemy, a single city of recovery fighting the same disease together. The reality was a hill divided in two, where the quality of your treatment depended less on the severity of your illness than on the color of your skin. It was the first sign of something that would define Waverly Hills for the rest of its existence, a willingness to protect the image of the institution, even when that meant leaving the truth quietly out of frame. Chapter 4: The Cure That Wasn't. Whatever Waverly Hills looked like from the outside, the truth inside its walls was far less reassuring. There was no cure for tuberculosis in 1926, and there would not be one for nearly 2 more decades. What the hospital offered instead was a long list of interventions, some genuinely helpful, many of them closer to controlled violence than medicine, all of them aimed at a disease doctors could observe perfectly well and understand only partially. Heliotherapy was the gentlest of these. Patients, particularly children with tuberculosis affecting their bones, were wheeled out onto the 5th floor rooftop and left beneath direct sunlight for hours at a stretch, on the theory that ultraviolet light could fight infection the way it lightened skin. It was painless, even pleasant in good weather, and it did patients no real harm. The treatments that followed it were not nearly so kind. Artificial pneumothorax involved deliberately collapsing a patient's infected lung by injecting air or nitrogen into the chest cavity, the idea being that a lung at rest, rather than constantly expanding and contracting around damaged tissue, had a better chance to heal. It worked often enough that doctors trusted it, but it was not a one-time procedure. The air would slowly absorb back into the body, and the lung would begin to reinflate, so patients returned again and again, sometimes for years, to have the procedure repeated. When pneumothorax failed, the next step was thoracoplasty, and there was no gentle way to describe what that involved. Surgeons removed a patient's ribs, collapsing the chest wall permanently onto the damaged lung beneath it. Doctors rarely removed more than 2 or 3 ribs in a single operation, judging it too dangerous to do more at once, which meant some patients endured multiple separate surgeries, months apart, each one taking another piece of their own skeleton in the hope that the next operation would finally be the last. For patients whose disease had spread or concentrated in one section, surgeons sometimes went further still, cutting away the infected portion of the lung entirely in a procedure called a lobectomy, or deliberately crushing the nerve that controlled one side of the diaphragm to paralyze it, on the theory that a lung that moved less would heal faster. None of these were treatments in the sense we would recognize today. They were educated gambles performed on patients who had no real alternative, by doctors who genuinely believed they were doing everything medical science allowed. For patients whose tuberculosis had progressed into the brain or whose psychological state had deteriorated under the weight of the disease, electrotherapy was sometimes administered as well, in the hope that it might counteract some of the mental effects of advanced illness. By most honest accounts, it accomplished very little. What ties all of this together is not any single procedure, but the philosophy sitting underneath every one of them, a conviction held with total sincerity by the medical staff at Waverly Hills that the mind and the body were fighting the same war and that one could not be expected to win without the other. Doctors of the era believed, as a matter of clinical fact rather than sentiment, that a patient's morale directly influenced their chances of survival. Hope was treated almost like a prescription. Despair was treated almost like a symptom, one that could spread through a ward as easily as the bacteria itself. This belief shaped nearly everything about daily life on the Hill. The occupational therapy classes, the radio listening rooms wired into every solarium, the deliberate effort to keep patients occupied, distracted, and optimistic about their own chances. It was, in many ways, a humane impulse. Nobody wanted patients lying in bed convinced they were already dead. But that same belief carried a darker implication, one the hospital's administrators would eventually act on without ever quite saying it out loud. If morale could keep a patient alive, then anything that damaged morale could, by the same logic, help kill them. And nothing damaged morale faster or more visibly than watching your neighbors disappear, day after day, one stretcher at a time. Chapter 5. Daily Life on the Hill. Despite the violence happening in operating rooms, life at Waverly Hills was, for most patients on most days, defined less by surgery and more by waiting. Tuberculosis was slow. A diagnosis did not mean weeks in a hospital bed. It meant months, often years, with no fixed date of release and no guarantee that release would ever come. Patients admitted to the Hill rarely knew, on the day they arrived, whether they were checking into a temporary stay or the place where they would die. The daily routine reflected that uncertainty. Mornings began early, with long hours spent resting on the open-air porches, regardless of the season. Patients bundled under blankets in winter, the cold air itself considered part of the treatment. Meals arrived on a fixed schedule from a kitchen built to serve well over 2,000 plates a day. Between rest periods, patients well enough to move occupied themselves with whatever the hospital provided. Basket weaving, typing classes, simple craft work meant less to teach a skill than to occupy a mind that otherwise had nothing to do but count the days. Wired into the walls between sets of solarium doors were radio receptacles, installed early on so patients could plug in a set of headphones and listen to whatever was playing on the local stations. A small, deliberate effort to keep the outside world from feeling completely out of reach. Family visits were limited, and for good reason. Tuberculosis spread easily, and a hospital built around isolation could not afford to treat its own quarantine as optional. Parents waved at children through solarium windows. Husbands and wives wrote letters they could not always be sure would be answered. For children admitted without their parents, sometimes for years at a stretch, that isolation amounted to growing up almost entirely inside the institution, surrounded by nurses and other sick children instead of family. And running underneath all of it was something harder to treat than the disease itself: shame. Tuberculosis carried a social weight that other illnesses did not. To have it was to be, in the eyes of many, marked, dangerous to be near, somehow responsible for your own condition. Patients frequently hid their diagnosis from friends, embarrassed to admit where they had disappeared to, or for how long. Lily Gilliam understood that shame personally. Diagnosed with tuberculosis in the late 1940s at 14 years old, she was the only one of her parents' 7 children to contract the disease, pulled out of her first semester at Central High School, and admitted to Waverly Hills segregated ward, the same outdated wooden buildings that Black patients had been confined to since the new Gothic hospital first opened its doors. She spent 2 years there, watching her friends continue on with ordinary teenage life without her. And she would later describe feeling too embarrassed to tell anyone where she had gone, since at the time, tuberculosis was widely regarded as a feared and shameful disease rather than simply an illness. She was not alone in that feeling. Across the hill, in both the gleaming new building and the older structure beside it, patients carried the same quiet humiliation, even as the quality of care they received depended entirely on which side of that line they had been assigned to. By the time she left, tuberculosis was no longer the death sentence it had once been. But for 2 years, Lily Gilliam lived inside the very contradiction Waverly Hills was built on, a hospital that promised recovery to everyone and delivered it unevenly depending on who you were when you walked through the gate. Chapter 6. When the dying outnumbered the living. By the time the new Gothic building had been open a few years, Waverly Hills had a logistics problem nobody wanted to put in writing. A self-sufficient hospital perched on a hillside needed a way to move coal up to its boilers, food up to its kitchens, and supplies up to its wards without trucks grinding up the same gravel drive that patients used to arrive for the first time, hopeful, in cars driven by frightened families. So, a tunnel was cut directly into the hillside, a long, sloping passage running from the base of the hill, near the railroad tracks at the bottom, up into the basement of the main building. Equipped with a motorized rail and cable system, it let carts move steadily up the slope, carrying everything the hospital needed to keep running. On paper, it was nothing more sinister than infrastructure. It ran just over 525 feet, sloped at a steep, deliberate angle, the concrete walls swallowing sound, the way only an enclosed underground space can. Stand at the bottom and look up, and the tunnel mouth at the top is barely visible. Stand at the top and look down, and the darkness simply continues until it doesn't. That same passage, built to solve a supply problem, soon took on a second purpose, by most accounts. Death at Waverly Hills was not occasional, it was constant, and at times it accelerated to a pace the hospital's own architecture had never been designed to hide. Tuberculosis, untreated by anything resembling a true cure, killed slowly enough that patients could watch it happen to the people around them, and quickly enough that it happened often. On the worst weeks, a dozen or more patients might die within a matter of days. Every one of those deaths required the same outcome. A body had to leave the building, dignified, discreet, and gone before the next meal was served. The obvious route was the route the hospital avoided, according to long-standing accounts from former staff, passed down rather than recorded in any single surviving memo. Bodies were instead brought down to the basement, placed onto the same rail cart system used for hauling coal and crates, and lowered down that 525-foot tunnel to a waiting hearse or rail car at the bottom of the hill. From the moment a patient died to the moment their body left the property, almost nobody upstairs would have seen it happen. This is the part of the story most often told as a kindness, and on its surface, it was one. The doctors at Waverly Hills had built an entire treatment philosophy around the idea that a patient's morale directly affected their odds of survival. If hope could help a patient heal, then despair, by the same logic, could help kill them. And nothing manufactured despair faster than watching, day after day, as your neighbor in the next bed was wheeled out and never came back. A hospital trying to keep its patients fighting could not afford to let them count the bodies. A hospital that hides its dead to protect the morale of the living is also, automatically and inescapably, a hospital protecting its own reputation. Waverly Hills had been built and marketed as a city of recovery, a gleaming, self-sufficient institution with its own power plant, its own post office, its own promise that science and fresh air could beat back the White Plague. That image was not incidental to the hospital's survival. It was the entire basis on which the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital justified its funding, the entire reason families trusted the institution enough to send their sick relatives up that hill in the first place. Chapter 7: The Reckoning of Numbers. If the tunnel itself raises an uncomfortable question about motive, the number of bodies that pass through it raises an entirely different one. Nobody, including the hospital itself, ever actually agreed on how many that was. Walk into almost any modern telling of the Waverly Hills story, and you will hear the same staggering figure repeated with total confidence. Somewhere between 50,000 and 63,000 deaths over the hospital's operating history, presented less as an estimate than as settled fact. It is the number printed on tour brochures, repeated by ghost hunting television crews, and treated as common knowledge by anyone who has spent 5 minutes researching the building online. It is also, by almost every available historical record, dramatically inflated. The most carefully sourced estimate comes not from a paranormal investigator, but from someone who actually worked inside the institution. Dr. J. Frank Stewart, a former assistant medical director at Waverly Hills, stated plainly that the worst single year on record saw 152 deaths, a brutal number on its own terms, but nowhere near the scale required to reach tens of thousands across the hospital's roughly 51 years of operation. Partial death indexes compiled from surviving hospital and county records put the total somewhere closer to 6,000 to 8,000 patients over that entire span. 6,000 to 8,000 deaths is still a staggering number. It represents thousands of individual people, families, names that in many cases were never properly recorded, buried in counties and cemeteries that have long since lost track of them. It does not need exaggeration to be tragic, and yet exaggeration is exactly what happened to it. The reason is not difficult to find. 50,000 sounds like a massacre. 63,000 sounds almost apocalyptic. A number large enough to suggest a building so saturated with death that it could not possibly be anything other than haunted. 6,000 to 8,000, even though it represents the same scale of individual human tragedy, simply does not generate the same reaction. It does not sell tickets to a midnight tour as effectively. It does not make for as compelling an opening line on a paranormal television special. So, the larger number survived, repeated often enough by enough different sources, that it eventually stopped sounding like a claim and started sounding like a fact. Few of the people repeating it ever traced it back to where it actually came from, because by the time it reached them, the number had already done its job. It had made the building sound more haunted than the historical record could support on its own, which made for a better story, which sold more tickets, which meant nobody had much incentive to go back and check. It is worth sitting with the contrast directly. The real number, sourced and modest by comparison, asks you to imagine 8,000 individual deaths inside one building over 51 years. The popular number asks you to imagine something closer to a catastrophe. Only one of those numbers is true. Only one of them, somehow, became the one people remember. Chapter 8: The Cure Arrives, the Hill Empties. For 33 years, Waverly Hills had operated on a foundation of educated guesswork to manage the gap between hope and reality. Then, in 1943, that foundation finally gave way to something real. A researcher working in a laboratory isolated a compound called streptomycin, derived from a soil bacterium, and early tests showed something that decades of pneumothorax treatments and thoracoplasties never had. It actually killed the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis. For the first time since the disease had been identified, doctors had something that functioned less like a hopeful theory and more like an actual cure. It did not arrive at Waverly Hills overnight. New drugs in that era moved slowly from laboratory to hospital ward. It would take roughly 6 more years before streptomycin became widely available to patients at Waverly Hills itself, arriving in meaningful supply around 1949. For patients who had spent that final stretch enduring rib removals and lung collapses with no end in sight, the timing was a cruel kind of irony. The cure existed for years before it ever reached the building, built specifically to treat people like them. Once it did arrive, the change was undeniable, if not instant. Tuberculosis cases that had once meant years of institutional confinement could increasingly be treated with antibiotics on an outpatient basis. Throughout the 1950s, admissions at the hospital declined steadily. The wards that had once overflowed into tents on the lawn began, for the first time in the hospital's history, to feel genuinely spacious. Floors that had housed patients shoulder to shoulder through the worst years of the epidemic stood increasingly empty, their solariums catching sunlight that fewer and fewer people remained to use. It is worth pausing on what that decline actually represented. This was not a hospital failing. It was a hospital succeeding itself out of a job. A victory so complete that the institution built to fight the White Plague no longer had enough of the disease left to justify its own existence. Few hospitals in American history have closed for that particular reason. By June of 1961, the math had become unavoidable. The remaining patients were transferred to another facility, better suited to a population that no longer required an entire self-sufficient city on a hillside. Waverly Hills Sanatorium closed its doors as a tuberculosis hospital. The building did not stay empty for long, but what came next would prove that closing the hospital had not closed the door on tragedy at Waverly Hills. It had simply opened a different one. Chapter 9. Woodhaven. The building did not stay empty for long. Within roughly a year of the tuberculosis hospital's closure, Waverly Hills reopened under a new name and a new purpose: Woodhaven Geriatric Center, a nursing home intended to care for elderly patients suffering from dementia, mobility loss, and severe mental and physical disabilities. It was 1962, and the same 5-story Gothic building that had once been marketed as a city of recovery for tuberculosis, patients now took on an entirely different population, one even less equipped to advocate for itself than the patients who had come before. On paper, Woodhaven's mission sounded almost compassionate, a place for society's most vulnerable elderly and disabled residents to receive long-term care in a stable, supervised setting. In practice, the institution inherited none of the careful infrastructure that had once made Waverly Hills self-sufficient and well-funded, and almost none of the public attention that had once kept the tuberculosis hospital under scrutiny. Woodhaven was chronically understaffed from very early on, expected to care for a growing population of residents with complex medical and psychiatric needs, using a fraction of the staff such care actually required. Reports of neglect began circulating almost immediately and never meaningfully stopped. Over the 2 decades that followed, the allegations against Woodhaven only grew darker. Former staff and visiting families described residents left unwashed and unattended for long stretches, living conditions that deteriorated into genuine squalor, including persistent cockroach infestations throughout patient areas. Most disturbing were the recurring accounts of outdated and misused medical interventions. Many of Woodhaven's patients had no surviving family to advocate on their behalf, no one checking in regularly enough to notice when conditions worsened, no one positioned to file a complaint that anyone in power would actually act on. The same isolation that had once protected tuberculosis patients from contagion now protected an entirely different institution from accountability. It took until 1982 for the state of Kentucky to formally intervene. A grand jury investigation into Woodhaven uncovered exactly what years of quiet rumor had suggested: documented evidence of patient abuse, severe neglect, and facility conditions unfit for the vulnerable population living inside them. The findings were serious enough that the state moved to close Woodhaven permanently that same year, transferring its remaining residents to other care facilities better equipped, at least nominally, to meet basic standards of care. Waverly Hills had spent half a century learning, in one way or another, how institutions protect their own image at the expense of the people inside them. Woodhaven proved that lesson had not been limited to a single disease, a single decade, or a single set of administrators. The building changed names, changed populations, changed missions entirely, and somehow arrived at the same failure twice. Chapter 10. The Wilderness Years. After Woodhaven's forced closure, the building did not find a new purpose. For nearly 2 decades, it simply sat. The first attempt to give it new life came from a developer named J. Clifford Todd, who purchased the property in the early 1980s for a little over $3 million. Working with an architect, Todd proposed converting the old hospital into a minimum security prison for the state. a plan that made a certain practical sense given the building's scale and isolation, and that collapsed almost immediately under the weight of furious local opposition. Residents living near the hill wanted nothing to do with a prison in their backyard, and the protests were loud enough that Todd abandoned the idea outright. The building's strangest brush with reinvention came over a decade later, when a man named Robert Alberhaski purchased the property with an idea almost nobody could have predicted. Alberhaski envisioned constructing the world's tallest statue of Jesus Christ directly on the roof of the old sanatorium. The plan called for the old hospital itself to eventually become a chapel, a theater, and a gift shop, built around the statue rising above it. The first phase alone was projected to cost $4 million. The full project, including the conversion of the building, was estimated at $8 million or more. Alberhaski spent roughly a year trying to raise that money from donors across the country. He managed to collect around $3,000. It was during this long stretch of true abandonment that Waverly Hills became something it had never been during its operating years, famous for the wrong reasons. With no security, no active use, and no one watching closely, the empty building became an irresistible target for trespassing teenagers, urban explorers, and the simply curious, slipping through broken windows and unlocked doors to wander halls that had been emptied of patients but never quite emptied of their history. This is the period, almost without exception, where the building's modern ghost stories actually originate. Not from 1926, not from the height of the tuberculosis epidemic, but from teenagers with flashlights in the 1980s and 90s, telling each other stories in the dark. The most famous of them centers on room 502, where legend holds that a nurse hanged herself in 1928 after an unwanted pregnancy. Her ghost still said to linger in the room and the hallway outside it. The story exists almost entirely as something repeated by visitors during the building's empty years, gaining detail and certainty with each retelling until it calcified into something treated as established fact. None of this required the building to actually be haunted. It only required the building to be empty, dark, and full of real, well-documented tragedy lying just beneath the surface. Fertile ground for stories to take root, with no one left inside to contradict them. Chapter 11. Resurrection as a Brand. None of that required the building to be haunted, but it did require someone, eventually, to notice that it had become exactly that in the public imagination. And in 2001, two people did. Charlie and Tina Mattingly purchased the long-abandoned property that year, and unlike every owner before them, they did not arrive with plans to turn it into a prison, an apartment complex, or a monument to anything other than itself. They founded the Waverly Hills Historical Society a couple of years afterward, framing their purchase as an act of preservation, a genuine effort to save a building that had spent nearly 2 decades rotting under broken windows and graffiti. Restoration on a structure that size, with that much asbestos, water damage, and structural decay, required money on a scale far beyond what 2 private individuals could realistically self-fund. So, they turned to the one resource the building already had in abundance: its reputation. Within roughly a year of purchase, Waverly Hills opened for guided historical tours, walking paying visitors through the same corridors where tuberculosis patients had once waited out their disease. But it was the parallel offering, paranormal tours through the same spaces after dark, that became the institution's true financial engine. Visitors paid to walk the body chute at night, to sit in room 502, to bring their own EMF meters and recorders into a building whose darkest legends had been manufactured largely by trespassing teenagers a decade earlier. Every dollar collected went, at least in principle, toward keeping the roof from collapsing and the windows from staying broken. The annual Halloween haunted house attraction, built around actors and theatrical scares layered onto the building's real history, became one of the single largest revenue events of the year, drawing thousands of visitors during a few weeks each autumn and funding restoration work. The rest of the calendar could not support on its own. It would be hard to overstate how much external media accelerated what the Mattingleys started. A touring metal festival even held its final show on the grounds 2 years later, treating the building as little more than dramatic scenery. And in the years since, A steady stream of viral internet content, including widely watched overnight investigation videos, has kept introducing new audiences to the building almost entirely through the lens of the supernatural rather than the historical. The numbers tell their own story. As of recent years, Waverly Hills draws something close to 40,000 visitors annually, a figure built largely on paranormal tourism rather than historical interest alone. Daytime historical tours run in the range of $25 to $35 per person. Overnight, paranormal investigations cost considerably more. Whatever else can be said about the restoration, it has been funded almost entirely by visitors paying to be frightened rather than visitors paying to learn. Chapter 12: What the Ghost Stories Replaced. If you take a paranormal tour of Waverly Hills today, you will hear at length about Room 502 and about shadow figures said to drift through the body chute after dark. You will almost certainly not hear about Lily Gilliam or anyone like her, the patients confined to the old wooden dispensary, while the new Gothic building filled with white patients down the hall, treated under a different standard of care simply because of the color of their skin. That part of the building's history requires no embellishment to be disturbing. It is simply less marketable than a ghost. This is the same building doing the same thing twice. Today, the institution built an image of itself as one of the most haunted places in America, drawing in visitors with stories while the documented suffering of segregated patients, geriatric residents abused at Woodhaven, and thousands of real tuberculosis deaths sits unmentioned on the tour. And almost entirely absent from either version of the story are the people who actually kept the institution running. Their names rarely come up on a ghost tour. There is no haunted house attraction built around quiet, unglamorous endurance. This is ultimately the most uncomfortable truth about Waverly Hills as it exists today. The real horror of this place was never particularly hard to find. It is in the death index, in the segregation records, in the grand jury findings from Woodhaven. None of it is hidden. A building where thousands of people died slowly, of a disease that filled their lungs with fluid until they could no longer breathe, is today best known to most of the country as a Halloween attraction with a famous tunnel and a ghost named Mary. The paranormal industry did not invent Waverly Hills darkness out of nothing. It found darkness that was already there, repackaged it into something easier to sell, and in doing so, made the original documented tragedy harder to see than the version built specifically to entertain. Chapter 13: The Reason the Living Come. Picture the tunnel again, the way it was described at the very beginning of this story. The tunnel was never really about the dead. It was about everyone left standing above it, and about an institution that needed those people to keep believing recovery was possible, even as the evidence against that belief was wheeled past their windows with increasing frequency. Kindness and self-preservation happened to point in the same direction on that hill, and for as long as the tunnel stayed hidden. What feels strangest now is not that the tunnel existed. Institutions manage appearances. They always have, long before this hill had a name borrowed from a novel, and long after the last tuberculosis patient left its wards. What feels strange is what came afterward, that the same structure built to keep death out of sight has become the single biggest reason people choose to come looking for it. Waverly Hills did not need an exaggerated death toll or an unverified ghost story to be worth remembering. It was already enough. The tunnel still slopes downward into the same darkness it always did. The only thing that changed is who walks toward it and why. Once, it was built so the living would not have to see how many were dying. Now, it is the reason the living show up at all.